All right. Welcome. We might as well mention right up top here that Ben he's not potting through his own personal sickness, but he has some kid issues here that he may have to jump off a little bit later. So we'll front load the Seahawks for you if you want to do that.
I just got permission to stay for 45 minutes, and then I'm off to pick up.
Okay, well, 45 minutes equals an hour and a half then in our time, so we're good. We're good to go. We're good to go for a while here. Anyway, welcome. Unexpected Points. Bad intro here. We're going to talk front offices. So again, we got to be fast here. We got to get to the content. So right up front, we've done this exercise. Ben and I have done this for a few years now. It never gets any easier, I don't think, unless you take a nihilistic view towards it, which I think may be the best way to go here on front offices. So what we're going to do is, I'll just lay it out up front. We're going to talk process a bit, the messy process of ranking front offices. We're going to talk some front offices we just want to go through, although they don't make our top 5 or bottom 5, and those are the ones we're going to concentrate on the most to enrage fans. We got a lot of beeps going on over there. So we're gonna do that, and then try to get out of here. If I have to close it out on my own, I may have to get Ben's top 5 and bottom 5, and then close it out on my own. So, Mr. Baldwin, okay, do you want me to start with my process thoughts here, and then you're going to jump in, or do you have some overlying process you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was going to ask. Or we can kind of lay out how we're thinking about this. So it's not like which team has the best analysts or the best models. It's really from the outside based on the decisions that we can see, which is just a small part of what goes into team building and everything. This is us on the outside giving our impressions of how we view the decisions and kind of high level strategy that teams have made. At least that's how I'm thinking about this.
Yeah, that's basically how I'm thinking about it. I mean, maybe we give some benefit of the doubt in situations where we think there can be some analysts there. But I think as we've learned a lot, even if you have analytically minded people in the front office, even if you have a GM who you might consider to be analytically minded, doesn't mean those decisions are coming down in that sort of manner, whether it's the owner, whether it's job preservation, whatever it is coming through. So I think ultimately you're right. The proof is in the pudding. What you're putting out there as far as your decisions are that we can judge are going to be the main thing that I'm going to look at. I have numbers that I calculate for value added in millions of dollars is how I try to do it for surplus value in the draft. So I have those for the last 2 years and teams rankings that I'm looking at there. So that comes into part of my process. Looking at offseason moves, making some adjustments based upon that. So I try to be as quantitative as possible, ranking the teams, and then I'm going to make some adjustments based upon that. Now, I will say up front that, and do you agree with this or not? Number one, generally ranking front offices may be in the media, and I look at some others, and I have like some consensus that I try to look at for this. They're probably like some of the worst rankings you're going to come across in the as far as who are actually good front offices or not. Mainly because no one has any idea how to base these guys. You think, like, at least for power rankings, and team power rankings are pretty awful, right? Like they just order like by record basically and move it around a little bit. At least the record for the team is pretty representative of how good the team is. Now, there's some guys that go up or down based upon strength of schedule, luck, and all this sort of stuff. Like, that's a pretty good measure. When teams are rank ordering GMs based upon how well the teams are doing by record, in my opinion, that's like very unrepresentative of how good the GM, at least over short windows of time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things for the listeners. Kevin sent me a couple lists of consensus best GM rankings, and the first thing that jumps out is like it's very, very, very highly correlated with how good these teams were in the most recent season. And like, for example, the Ravens had a huge jump, and I think Kevin and I have both been high on the Ravens throughout this whole time period. But for outsiders, they won a lot of games in 2023, so we're going to upgrade their front office rankings, which I think is probably not the best way to approach this, or at least a different way than we approach this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm pulling these rankings from different sources because before it was Greg Rosenthal had done them at NFL.com last year, and that's what I pulled it from. I pulled it from the only place I could figure out for this year. But I mean, there's some similarities, but there are some differences. You mentioned the Ravens. Yeah, the Ravens having a big jump, I think is interesting. And they had the whole Lamar Jackson re-signing and then flipping over to MVP. That's a pretty switch up. This and that. Another big jump is the Texans.
Yep.
And
we'll talk about them, I'm sure.
We'll talk about them a bit because I don't know if I'm buying their success, but they're jumping up into the top 10 in a lot of lists. Some moves down. The Bills moving down quite a bit here, and I think that's probably true of popular sentiment. I was not as high on them as you were before. I see the Seahawks moving down, but I think that's just noise between the rankers here. I don't think that actually means anything. So we'll talk about all that. And I guess the other factor here is we have a lot of front offices that are fairly new. So, or within 1 year, I think in 2 years, you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. 1 year is a little bit tougher. And, but we do get some hint, I think, even in a year, Raiders, that you might just be bad as far as this is concerned. So that's one thing. And then, so there's my principles. Number one, it's just hard to do. And the media is most wrong about these sorts of ratings versus anything else. I mean, even coaching, you can see a little bit more into what's going on in coaching, in my opinion. And again, we're just rating on whether their picks hit or not. And we realize or their signings hit or not. And we realize that's a coin flipping sort of exercise. And I'll also say that at least for mine, and maybe you can talk about this, I'm a little bit more confident in like bad versus good sometimes, because the good is always mitigated in some way by we have a kind of an ideal way that we think a front office should be run. So then even the front offices that are good, they're just making fewer mistakes. So at least in my opinion, I think it was a little bit easier for me to just stick with a lot of the front offices I thought were bad from the previous year. And then I have more that maybe I want to shift around as we learn more about who could potentially be good.
Yep, I think that's right. I think it's pretty easy to say when teams make indefensible moves. And for the teams that do that over and over again, it's pretty easy to say, we don't really agree with this team's process. And at least for me, a lot of what makes the good teams is that they just tend to avoid these mistakes, or when they make to preview a team in the top 5, like the Eagles always trade up in the draft, which we don't really think is a good idea. But these trades are like small moves up by a couple picks rather than like a giant trade up where they're sending a future first round pick or something like that. So even no team is perfect, but the teams at the top, when they do let themselves make mistakes, they're not as crippling as other mistakes that some other teams make.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, we'll get to the Eagles, but they also mitigate and even fully more than mitigated at least their trade losses by making some trade downs, I think, this year. So they're an interesting case. They're an interesting case with the Eagles. Okay, so we're going to talk through some teams first before we get to the bottom and top 5. I'm going to start on the positive side so we don't get everyone tuning out immediately for team, because I'm going to start with some teams that I want to talk about, because I'm going to talk about some negatives, and these are mostly like teams that are doing well that I'm still questioning quite a bit. And of course, those are the ones that people are the most upset about when it comes to our commentary. But I want to talk about a couple of newer front offices. How do we think about them? Because I feel like they've done okay so far. Not perfect by any means, lots of risk in different strategies, but I want to talk specifically about the Bears and the Titans. The Bears is a little bit different because this is the third offseason now, right? Third offseason for Ryan Poles. Yeah. And like, how do we think about what he's done there? Because I do think there have been some questionable moves, like trading a second-round pick, which ended up being an early second-round pick for Chase Claypool. Yep. Very questionable moves there. Trading away Roquan Smith and then signing some guys in free agency, which I don't feel that poorly about, but some others might. Drafting a extremely old receiver last year, things like that. But generally, I'll say that according to my numbers, I was surprised to see how good they look over the last couple of years and what they've done in the draft. And you could say maybe it's just like a function of the fact that they've been really, really bad and they got the Panthers pick. So then that double affected there, that they had a really good draft position that they traded out of. They made a ton of trade value in the last draft. They drafted a quarterback in this draft with that trade value, which was really, really good. But I don't think they've made a ton of mistakes even in the offseason. They spent money on some off-ball linebackers and others, but it's hard to really argue they made a lot of mistakes as far as trading away a lot or spending a lot of money on premium positions in free agency, which typically ends up to be a huge disappointment. But I don't know if I'm confident in them at this point. What do you think about Ryan Poles and the Chicago Bears?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Definitely hard to have confidence in them given some of their draft decisions and, like you mentioned, the Claypool trade. And it's hard to evaluate them just because they've had so many assets that, yeah, they like any team would have picked Caleb Williams first overall, and probably even Rome Odunze. They got him at number, it was 9 or something or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So like you take the last receiver in the top shelf and pair him with your rookie quarterback. That all seems pretty logical. I think a lot of people would have done that. Do we give them any credit for correctly deciding to move on from Justin Fields, given how much pushback there was to that originally, or do we think that most teams would have gotten that decision right eventually?
I mean, I'm not going to give them too much credit on that one because the pushback, in my opinion, was bogus. Well, we read all these articles about the locker room was going to be splintering apart and there are going to be riots on the street of Chicago and everyone's going to have put their Justin Fields jersey on and march down to, the front office and demand their heads. And then they traded him for nothing. And it was like out of the news cycle immediately.
Yep.
That's the next day. Fair. I mean, they did set it up. I think it was Diana Rossini and a bunch of other insiders were coming back from the combine and were like, yeah, basically this guy's worthless. Yep. And that's what they were telling everyone. So it was forecast a bit, but I think that kind of revealed the preferences of the fan base, that you had this loud minority of fans who were easily assuaged when it came to, guess, we have this new shiny Caleb Williams, and people are like, they totally forgot about Justin Fields.
Yep.
Now, I would have thought about getting rid of Justin Fields the year before, and technically the way things worked out, that would have been a worse decision. Because who knows? They could have Bryce Young on their roster now, right? Of course, they could have CJ Stroud too. So let's not say, it's necessarily the one thing. So technically everything worked out. And I think that, again, like that's one of these things where what's practical and what's ideal are different. Like this is, I think practically this was a pretty good work by Poles with good luck with the Panthers basically being a shit show and everything else there. And ideally he could have done something else last year and gotten rid of Fields, but it didn't really fall within the constraints of reality in the NFL.
Yeah, teams are I think they're so reluctant to make a decision that will make them look bad in the future. So like if they had traded Fields and he ended up working out at his next team, then they probably would have gotten roasted and were very afraid of that scenario.
Yeah. I mean, and it is like the chance that Justin Fields would be successful after two kind of poor years with definitively poor surroundings versus now a third year with pretty decent surroundings and then also being bad and regressing a lot on the rushing, which was throwing some people off the year before. Now I think you really can, close the door on Justin Fields probably being an elite quarterback, and that's what we're seeing in the market also. Okay, so the Bears first. The Titans, I don't know what to think about the Titans because I think they're trying to like thread a very risky maneuver here because they're building kind of a house out of old receivers that they're overpaying for, but they're drafting okay as far as positionally. They did get Will Levis at a decent spot, but they're also, built the house on a early second round quarterback who could completely bust there. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about here. I would have liked to see them maybe think about adding some more quarterback talent in this sort of draft. I mean, they did add an offensive tackle. It's obviously a position they need. So I guess I'm really more undecided on them, but I'm wondering if they can be decent only because they showed up as being pretty good by my numbers, by positional value and what they've done in the draft the last couple of years.
Yeah, their drafts look reasonable. I think we'll have a lot more information after a year, especially if Levis doesn't look like he will be the future, and then we'll see if they actually do the Bears thing and stick with him for another year, or open to looking for something else at that position.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really bad situation, I think, that that he was stepping into there. So, yeah. So that's another one that at least piqued my interest a bit, because they're not doing anything bad. I mean, they didn't make any trades, but they at least are getting some positional value. Whatever you think about, I know people are not in love necessarily with the big board rankings of Latham, the tackle they took, but whatever. Not making any big mistakes there. And if you're overpaying for guys, that's whatever. It's like you got some money to spend, so it's not the biggest deal. Okay, but again, I'm worried about Will Levis building everything on Will Levis. This could be like a Desmond Ridder, 2.0 type of situation with less stakes though, because no one thinks the Titans are going to be good. Anyway, some other teams that I want to comment on the positive-ish side, and this is okay. So this is for you here. We'll start with the Seahawks here. What about my theory now that the whole time all these running backs are being taken in the second round, strong safeties, or we're trading multiple first-round picks to get strong safeties. We're doing a lot of these things, infuriating things. We're reaching for guys, multiple rounds before where they should be taken, and they're not necessarily premium positions. All the staples of the Seahawks team building post the 2012 draft, where they just knocked everything out of the park. What if that was all Pete Carroll?
So I wish I could believe that. So you said this is going to be on the positive side. I actually still have the Seahawks in my bottom 5, so I'm a little bit less positive.
It's hard. You're one of those fans. Fans go in one of two directions, being too positive or too negative. So I like it. Okay.
So I think I say this every year, but it's possible I'm too harsh on the Seahawks because they're the team I follow. So for those of you who don't know, I'm from Seattle. I grew up as a Seahawks fan. They're the team I follow the closest, and there's been a lot of comments from John Schneider now that he is the guy in charge of the team that make me a little bit skeptical of all of the mistakes were Pete Carroll's fault. And one of them was this was a couple of months ago, but he was asked about the Jamal Adams trade, and he really doubled down on this trade. And he was like, he was the number 5 pick, and we had a pick in the 20s. So if we wanted to get him, then of course we had to send a future first round pick. But this wasn't it. First of all, if you were trading up to number 5 to draft a safety, that would be a bad idea. But that's not what they were doing. They were trading for a guy who needed a contract extension, and then gave him a market-setting extension on top of these 2 first-round picks. And here he is, 4 years later, saying there was nothing wrong with this. And maybe he's just saying that because he made the decision and he still wants to defend the decision. But if that is any glimpse at all into his thinking, not Pete Carroll's thinking, then it's a little bit worrying about, can we trust them to do the right thing in the future? There's also the Leonard Williams trade, which happened midseason because they thought they and the 49ers were both 5-3, and the Seahawks were going to compete in the division, even though at the time I think they had a negative point differential and had played the easiest schedule in the league or something like that. So, and they had already played the Rams.
I remember that around that time, I definitely heard some, hey, this team might have everything to really compete, right? To really compete for a Super Bowl. I heard that. They I know it's the Seahawks, but of course this is coupled with the Geno love, Geno love, because Geno is elite in some minds. So go ahead.
At the time, they hadn't played the 49ers, but there was no way they could think they were as good as the 49ers. And they had played the Rams once at home and gotten blown out by 20 points. So if you were a distant third place in your division, then I don't think it's right to trade a second-round pick for a guy at an expiring contract. And then after the draft, this is the last thing. Sorry, this is not a positive section, as Kevin promised earlier. But
well, it was more could we potentially be positive? Yeah. But go ahead.
After the draft, John Schneider was like, we had really good offers to trade down, but did not trade down. And I think that is also that one. This is the draft where Pete Carroll's not there anymore, and they had a chance to trade down. I'm really happy with the guy they took. I understand that there is possible talent cliff to the extent that we can identify these, which is we're probably very, very overconfident in our ability to do that. But coming out and saying we could have traded down, we had a good offers to trade down according to him, but decided not to. I think that's also a bit of a red flag. So until
just
we see
information they
evidence to the
didn't need to.
contrary,
You just didn't need to
yeah,
reveal
yeah,
that information, right?
yeah. And they've also, there's a lot of these teams, like we'll talk about the Saints later, that seem like they have a quarterback that's probably not an above average quarterback, and they seem content just like trying to win 9 or 10 games and sneak into the playoffs and never actually be a competitor and never have a backup plan at quarterback if you want to actually like try to be searching for the next elite guy on your roster.
Okay, all right, you shot that down pretty well. I'm somewhat convinced, but I'll hold out hope. I just like my theory. I like my theory that everything was Pete Carroll's fault. Okay. Well, how about, this is another one. How about Dallas Cowboys, where I know that they have been, and it was actually mentioned in that article by, was it Alec Lewis,
yeah, from the
who wrote an article about, we all know what to do in the draft, but no one does it. And they talk about how Jerry Jones was kind of interested in some analytics, he's interested in wrestling up some analytics, and they get it, and then they just don't follow any of it. But I know that they've like secretly been ahead of the curve there. There's a guy who works for the Browns who used to work for the Cowboys back in the day. They had commissioned some other people I know to provide them with research. They had some people consulting there who I know of who were pretty well, who, sat in some meetings that they've had at the combine and other things. So what about in a similar way? Let's substitute Jerry Jones for Pete Carroll in this situation. So Jerry Jones now is officially like hit Joe Biden levels of senility, and he's sorry, I didn't mean to get political here. Anyone out there? So maybe he's just been put in the corner, and he's just like telling the. They're like, go ahead, grandpa, tell him we're going to draft a running back next round or whatever. And then we're not actually going to do it. And maybe Stephen Jones is like woke. He's analytically woke. And now they're going to look better going forward. Cause I thought they did a pretty good job. I mean, it was basically one trade down, but I thought they've done a pretty good job in a tough situation because they have Dak Prescott making, I think $55 million cap hit this season.
Yeah, I was very close to putting them in my top 5. So
oh, wow.
This is definitely a more positive view. I actually did have them in my top 5, and then I thought it was being too harsh on a team to drop them out of my that we'll talk about later, to drop them out of ranking. So if there was a 5B, I would have put the Cowboys. And I think there's a lot to like about what they do. I think they draft pretty well, both in terms of using their high picks on high value positions, and then they did, as you noted, they did a good job with the trade down. If we were going to nitpick, it's like their refusal to extend players ahead of time. So this is like in contrast to the Eagles, where if there's a premium position guy that needs extended, they're going to do it and not have to wait and end up paying a lot more. And this might end up costing the Cowboys dearly if they can't actually extend Dak Prescott and they pay him $55 million and then he walks after this year. They're good. Like, that would not be a good situation for them.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. I may be a little bit more ambivalent, especially when people bring up the Eagles as an example, because they're just throwing the bag at a lot of people and extending void years and other nonsense out into infinity. So like, if you want to play that game, you can do that too. Okay, so now I want to go over to more on the negative side. I think I kind of hammered the Vikings and Kwesi a little bit here, but maybe I can get your take on there. I guess it's just like, we believed in you. And now you're just trading up for edge rushers because they fell on the board. And I don't really know what's going on there generally, although I think they did an okay job with, they kept Cousins. They made the move from Cousins. They got the quarterback, but I don't know. It's just, again, it's one of those things where you want to have faith that maybe in a macro view, they're moving in the right directions. But when it comes to the micro decisions, is it being implemented the right way and being able to resist some of the traps of the job?
Yeah, I didn't have them in my top or bottom 5. I think they're probably in the massive teams that it's just like, I think it's Eric Eager's term is like most teams are just following a random walk of decision making where there's no like systematically good or bad decisions. They just kind of make decisions, and some are good and some are bad. Obviously, we did not like the draft date or the draft trades that the Vikings made this year, but other years they've done better things, I think. And at least they were able to come up with a succession plan for Kirk Cousins. after moving on for him. So I think their outlook is not terrible, but it at the same time, it also is hard to get over how they approach the draft, and then looking at their draft picks for this coming year is kind of bleak.
Yeah, I mean, I'll cut them a little bit of slack because I do I do think they're doing the right thing in some ways of saying, we don't have a quarterback. We're not going to play this game of, oh, we wanted Drake May, but he wasn't available. So, we're going to like build to draft a quarterback next year or whatever. They were just fully 100% like, we're just going to take a quarterback, like who it is. And that's what teams should be doing. Because it's like, do you take your quarterback and then you figure it out. If it doesn't work, then you take another quarterback. And you keep on moving forward. So yeah, I don't know. I not fully canceled yet for Kwesi, but we'll see. Okay, and then there's a bucket of 3 teams that I want to mention. Well, number one, I want to mention the Raiders, where I didn't put them as the worst because technically it's the first year for the front office, but they're probably the worst, or close to the worst. So, but we don't really need to comment on that too much. But Detroit, 49ers, and the Houston Texans. I want to talk about these 3 teams because, again, I mentioned these are teams that are now near the top of everyone's rankings because they've done well over the years, and I just don't see value-added moves happening here other than hitting on picks and, at least in the 49ers case, kind of building off of this roster that's been around for a while and then getting Brock Purdy to hit and then, breaking the mold when it came to Christian McCaffrey. Maybe there was more to that than you would have thought, but that can't be seen as necessarily a great trade, like pre-trade for process-wise. And just being in a pretty weak NFC, I guess, also where a bunch of other teams are falling apart. What do you think about these teams, and how do you want to think about results? Because maybe I'm building results a little bit more into my process. Like, I'm not going to put any of these guys in the bottom 5 where you might be able to make that argument in some way because they've had some success here. But how do you want to think about these teams that everyone loves because they're doing well, but it's really hard to find the process that looks great?
I had 2 of these teams in the bottom 5, so that might
okay. So
answer your
going
question.
Oh, actually, you know what? Now that I look, I do have 2 of these teams in the bottom 5. So one of them I don't, though. One of them I don't.
Is it the Lions? Is that one of the teams? That
I do not have the Lions in the bottom 5.
Okay, so we have the same 2 teams in the bottom 5, and not the Lions.
Okay.
Yeah, the Lions. They've done enough things well that I think I wouldn't put them in the bottom 5, but they are like, I think of them and the Colts in the same bucket, which I think the Colts are the team that we're always going to disagree about the
definitely.
most. But my view of both of these teams is they're like we're going to draft good football players. We don't care what position they play, and we're gonna build a roster of good football players. And both of these teams tend to allocate their resources, the Colts and the Lions, to players that aren't necessarily high value positions. And if you have a lot of those, like if a lot of your best or highest paid players are not premium positions, then you're not going to be very good. That does not describe the Lions, because like they hit on a 40, seems to be a pretty good quarterback, and then Penei Sewell, who was a reasonable draft pick, ended up hitting and is incredible. So like they're actually a pretty good team, and maybe the Colts will be too, depending on how Richardson goes. But neither one of them is like a team I would put as a model top 5 according to this process. But I'm sure we'll talk about the Colts eventually.
We will disagree on the Colts. Actually, you know what? I misstated. I took these 2. I took Houston and San Francisco out of my bottom 5, but they were last year. So I misstated. But again, they're like, it's on the border. It's like, it's pretty. It's tough to really. There's some others that I just thought were more deserving. Okay. Do I have anyone else that we need to talk? Well, how about Kansas City real fast? I don't know what to think about Kansas City. I'll give them credit for not going all in and kind of recognizing the Patrick Mahomes advantage and letting his cap hit be big, where, people like the Bills and others would restructure and go all in and this and that, and then still winning the Super Bowl. So that seems pretty good. At the same point in time, I don't know. I just feel like you're playing with everyone else is playing with one hand tied behind their back when you have Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce making no money because he's a tight end and he doesn't age for some reason. And you hit on some picks too, which, on defense, which is interesting. And I think that whatever you want to say about coaches, obviously they've had some great coaching defensively. So I don't know. I guess I'm just not as hyped about them as some others might be.
I ended up putting them in my top 5. And I think there's definitely the risk of overreaction to their success and how much easier they have it. But I think I can give them some credit for avoiding a lot of the traps that teams fall into when they think that like they have a window and they need to push their chips in and try to succeed within this window. And even in the past, the Chiefs did this where
Yeah, I was going to say, I think they kind of fell for that
the Frank
before.
Clark
Bringing
trade,
back Watkins and drafting CEH were two like win now sort of moves. But now I just don't know how much. Like for instance, the Bills have gone from win now last couple of years to now they're doing more sensible things. But how much of that is just like, oh, we tried to do win now and we failed?
Yeah, I think so. For both these teams, I think that is a good question. And for the Chiefs, in the early Mahomes years, they had some very bad decisions. So there's the CEH pick. There was the Frank Clark trade, which was like Chiefs fans will still defend this because he had all these sacks in the playoffs and Super Bowl. But I think the process of that trade was very poor. But since then, I think their team building has made more sense. The Tyreek Hill trade worked out. They've taken a lot of shots at wide receiver, kind of in like the sweet spot of the draft where you probably should be doing this in the second round. Although the Kadarius Toney trade was probably not a good one, so I should probably ding them for that. And
they're going to need him now with all of Rashid Rice. Who would ever thought drafting a guy that people had off their board supposedly in some places in the second round would not work out?
So I think they're in the last few years, most of what they've done has made sense. And but like we talked about, there's a tendency to correlate team success with team building success. And I think that's dangerous, especially when a team has Patrick Mahomes. But at the same time, at least over the last few years, they haven't made any like big mistakes. So I sort of trust what they're doing now.
Yeah, it's funny. We have a comment here. It says, when teams do win now and fail, but then change their approach, shouldn't they get credit for adapting? You get credit for not being the Saints. So who just go win now forever out into infinity until you're like, be mediocre now. Is now their new philosophy. So yeah, you get some credit there. I'm just saying, we just don't know like how much. Like if the win now thing would have worked, maybe they'd be piling into more win now. And when you can go win now, it fail. You have a retooling ish sort of year. These terms don't mean anything. But anyway, like a cap or taking some cap charges and you can win the Super Bowl. Like that's a pretty good spot to be in from a GM's perspective, right? It'd be like the Bills winning the Super Bowl this year, right? After they let go of their big receiver and they have cap, things, and it's definitely possible, but it helps. It helps. Okay, let's get into the rankings here. Let's go negative first. Okay, I'm gonna go back to negative here first here. So last year I did have the 49ers and the Houston Texans at 5th and 4th worst. I moved them over to dishonorable mention in my definitions here, as opposed to being 5th worst. And maybe I'll go 2 at a time here. So I'm going to start with the Giants, who I did not have in the bottom 5, going into the 5th worst, and then the Falcons, who were 3rd worst last year, now moving up slightly, not for any big reason, to 4th worst. So let me ask you, for either one of these two teams, because you mentioned you still have San Francisco and Houston in the bottom 5. Do you have the Giants or the Falcons in your bottom 5?
I did not have either, although I think I kind of regret not having the Giants in my top 5 now, but I'll keep what I have. I certainly understand the argument.
So here's the Giants argument. I think it's pretty easy. You're in purgatory hell right now when it comes to Daniel Jones. So just like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? What is the outcome here? Like, it's just hope. Like, where's the hope for this team? And maybe this is not a very analytical way of looking at it, but I just don't see what your hope is. So your hope is that you traded a bunch for a edge rusher and you're going to pay him a ton of money. You're paying Daniel Jones a ton of money. You don't draft a quarterback and you take a receiver. You hope Daniel Jones can kind of be like above average, doesn't get injured. And then you're like an okay team. Like that's it. And I don't know, like that's pretty bleak.
Yep. So my 5th worst was the Jets, and maybe I should have the Giants there instead. But I think like there's a lot of teams that one could put in the bottom 5.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the Jets then, because I still have the Jets as the 3rd worst. I had them the 2nd worst before. They actually were not bad this year,
Yep.
this offseason. But I can't forget, and again, how much you put on Joe Douglas versus how much you put on the ownership, like the Aaron Rodgers deal, just horrible trading up in the past that they've done for non-premium positions, drafting non-premium positions. They got some trade value this time. Now, again, they basically just stole money from the Vikings, moving down one pick, but they were willing to do that, where I guess there'd be some teams who may not be willing to do it. Again, I don't know where the hope is necessarily with this team, other than the fact that Aaron Rodgers returns to MVP form, but they didn't do anything awful this year. It's just the last few years they've been so bad that I still have them on the list.
Yep, pretty much exact same. There was a really interesting Bill Barnwell piece last week about trading up in the draft, and it's really hard to uncover like new kind of factoids about the draft and trades and draft cards and stuff like that. But one thing he pointed out that was really interesting is that it's not that trading up is good, but it's perhaps a little bit less bad than we might expect, because when teams trade up, they tend to do it for premium positions. So they're at least getting some value on it. But the Jets have not done that at all. They've traded up for, it was like a guard in the first round and then for a running back in the second round. So they're like, even among trade ups, they've done bad trade ups. And I know those weren't in the past year, but it's hard to forget the process there.
Yeah. I mean, the really bad one I think was a few years ago, so it doesn't even show up in some of the numbers that I'm looking at here for Elijah Vera Tucker, who, let me tell you, people were not happy about criticizing that trade up, and how are we looking now, guys? All right, so those fall into it for me. Maybe I'll just go through the rest of mine, and then you can tell me who else you have in here. So I don't know. I'm not sure why I didn't have these guys in before, other than the fact that they're relatively new and we don't know. But this is one that could blow up in my face if Bryce Young hits. But I'm going to put the Carolina Panthers as second worst, because, again, like, what are we doing over there in Carolina? We're drafting a running back in the second round. We're trading up to get a receiver. We could have just one pick that we could have just stayed for. We gave away, we blew the farm. We sold the farm to get Bryce Young, but I don't even know if they really have a good team around him. We're trading. You were trading Burns now, where we could have got a lot more for him in the past. It looks like the ownership situation is a total disaster there. So I put them all the way down at second worst now, where they probably should have already been creeping in the bottom five. But it was like there was still some hope with going for Bryce Young last year. And I don't think necessarily that was a really, really bad decision. But when you couple it with everything else that they're doing to help make them successful, it's hard to get behind it.
Yeah, I put them as honorable mention worst, so like sixth worst. And again, there's a lot of teams that could have been here. The reason I didn't put them in my bottom five is because I felt like I would have been punishing them too much for their quarterback not hitting and the Texans quarterback hitting. And if there's an alternate universe where like they had just like, I know they made the choice to pick Young, and maybe that was like mandated by ownership, which is not necessarily a good process, but like if they had the hit and the Texans had not had the hit, then I think both of those teams would be viewed a lot differently than they are now. And I'm sure we'll talk about the Texans later, but I think they're in the public view getting rewarded for a lot of things that they didn't necessarily control and weren't necessarily the result of good process. And for the Panthers, I think it's kind of the opposite, where their team was depleted because they made the trade up, but like you make the trade up in hopes that the quarterback hits, and if the quarterback doesn't hit, then like you're kind of screwed no matter what happens. So I have no trust in this front office, but I'm not sure they're that much worse than a lot of other teams.
Yeah, no, I'll give that to you. I mean, they extended like Derek Brown, who's been whatever, I don't know. Like, I wasn't into that pick when it first happened, but they're spending money on him. They're trying to they're going to throw some money at Jadeveon Clowney, who seems like very much like a piece you would add for a team that's competing, that would be doing something rather than he's a mercenary, right? Like he's the definition of a mercenary throughout his career. So it kind of seems more like that sort of move. And other than that, I don't know. There's just not much here. And I guess just Tepper, I thought that maybe he had some chance of talking a good game when it came to analytics at first. And now it's just, he's on tilt basically all the time. He's on tilt constantly, and that's not good for the organization. Okay, and then whatever. I have the Saints at worst, just because that's just where they live.
Yep, me too.
And again, talking about no hope, it's just like an organization with no hope. Like you're pouring more and more resources, trading up again, and then you're sitting there with just awful odds to even win the worst division in the NFL, and that's like your upside case. Is maybe winning the worst division in the NFL if everything else falls apart for the Falcons, is really your chance. So who am I missing else that you had there?
Did you have the Texans? Did the Texans get out of bottom 5 purgatory for you? Okay.
They did. So you still have the Texans. So let me say for the Texans, and the only reason I took them out is I am giving some credit to results. They did this bad trade up last year, but at least it was for a premium position, whatever. Yeah, it was bad. I don't know. I can't even talk myself into that. Maybe when it came to CJ Stroud, they just like took whoever fell to them. So that's not a bad sort of deal there. I have them as dishonorable mention, but I didn't want to put them in there just because some of these other teams, like there's no even hope in their strategy.
Yeah, I kept them here because I had them in the bottom 5 last year, probably primarily because of the Will Anderson trade. But it felt like rewarding them too much for their quarterback hitting to take them out. And maybe they'll get off the list, but I thought it'd be a little bit early this year. And there's a world where Stroud didn't work out and they're sending the number 1 pick to who did they trade? Was it the Cardinals that they traded up for?
Yeah.
And they're like, obviously we're very far from that world because they made the playoffs and the pick they sent was like 20 something. So it didn't even really turn out to be that big of a deal, but it was like a crazy trade to make when you have a rookie quarterback you've never seen play a snap in the NFL. Another point in their favor is that they were one of the multiple teams that fleeced the Vikings in trades this year. So that they traded back and added, I think they're getting a 2nd round pick back from the Vikings for next year. So that was good.
And that could be a good, you trade with teams who are taking quarterbats too, right?
Yeah.
We're going to have rookie quarterbacks.
Yeah. They're on the other side of that now. And they traded up in the 3rd round for a safety. I think it's less bad to trade up in later rounds than it is in early rounds, but perhaps not what I would have done. But I think they have a way out of this list depending on how the next year goes.
Yeah, and I think in your favor of having them on the list, and again, maybe I'm being too reactive to things working out. I don't think there's any way to spin the Stephon Diggs trade. Well, I should say that. There's definitely a way to spin it. The way to spin it is, they're going to win the Super Bowl this year. But like you're trading away a bunch and you're like throwing more money at him, and then he's going to be a free agent again after this. And I don't know. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, we talked about the trap of thinking like you need to go all in when
they're doing it now. They're in that window now where they're going to make the mistakes. And then if Stroud is good, like we still don't even know that at this point necessarily. I mean, it's pretty likely, but you don't know. Then you're going to be doing it again. And again, Danielle Hunter, I mean, it's fine, but that's a lot of money. Again, a lot of money for a premium position where maybe you roll that into, some other positions that you're not overpaying. You're not making top 5 player, top 10 player at their position in free agency. It's always a tough sort of gig. So those are 2 more moves that people probably are happy about because again, it's like cost is of no concern. So any move that makes the team better is viewed positively by the general public. And obviously that's not the way the world works. No matter, what stage of the rebuild that you're in. Anyone else that I missed from your bottom 5?
We talked about the 49ers a little bit, but that's the other team. So I had Jets 5th worst, and then 49ers, Seahawks, Texans, Saints. Honorable mention, Panthers.
Yeah, the 49ers, like my draft grading for them is like off the charts bad for what they've been doing. But hey, things keep working. So tip of the cap there. Okay, let's go through here. I know we were pressed for time a little bit here, but on the top 5. Now this is actually more stable for mine year over year. So I'll start a new one that I did add to the mix, which I didn't have before. It's the Jacksonville Jaguars, and we have 2 years of 2 years of getting out of the morass that they had with Urban Meyer. And they've actually been pretty good in the draft these 2 years, despite the fact that they're not getting a huge positional value bump for me for taking a quarterback because they already have one. They made some trade backs in both, and they've been successful doing that. They've been pretty good positional value wise with what they've been doing. They, let Calvin Ridley go rather than get into too much of a bidding war there, going with some lower priced options in free agency. It's more like haven't done anything bad and then picked up a little bit of value via trading down and being decent positional value. So maybe that's the course, right? The course is we have our quarterback and we're just going to continue to pile up relative advantage over the rest of the league. And in another, year or two, or maybe even this year, they're just going to start to bear fruits.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I thought a long time about which team to put at 5, and they're as good of a candidate as any other team. I think the one positional value ding is they did take Travis Etienne in the first round, right? But I guess
yeah. But then we're going back to Urban Meyer, so he's dead to us now.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
I don't know Bulky. I don't know what's necessarily going on there. But that's the thought. That's the thought there for them. Who do you have as your fifth team?
I have the Bills.
Okay, so I thought it would keeping them in there.
Yeah, I thought it'd be an overreaction to take them out, and there's things to ding them for. They've used a lot of day 2 picks on running backs. They haven't really invested in wide receiver to the extent that they probably should. I know they traded for Stephon Diggs, but they haven't really had a lot around him. But I'm keeping them on here for giving them a little bit of credit for trading away Diggs while they still could. And I know the immediate reaction to that move is what are they doing? They don't have a wide receiver, but I think it makes sense to do this now rather than wait till he has no value at all. I think you've argued this too. So they're another team that probably fell prey to the all-in thing, when they signed Von Miller, and they probably were all in, but they were also very, very close to actually winning. And I think people's view of this team would be different if they had won at least one of those 2 close playoff games against the Chiefs, and the fact that they didn't, and that the Chiefs cornerback first round pick hit and the Bills didn't. There's just a lot of randomness in this that I don't think we can necessarily hold against them. So I don't have that much faith in them, but I think most of their moves have made a reasonable amount of sense.
Yeah. I guess I just wasn't a fan of I'm a fan of what they're doing this year, but wasn't a fan of the all-endedness of what they'd done in the past, including an extension that they did in advance of for Stephon Diggs, which they didn't need to do. Just be a pain in the ass. That's the lesson. If you're a wide receiver, just send those cryptic tweets out and be a pain in the ass, and you'll be rewarded for it, like Stephon Diggs. Okay, so fourth for me, and this is a new one, and maybe I'm being too perspective on this one, but I'm actually putting the Arizona Cardinals in at number 4, just because I like the cut of their jib. I like what's going on over there. They're doing some trading back. They've been accumulating some value. I think they've been pretty, I kind of like the whole regime they got going on over there with Gannon and everyone else. They just seem to be, and maybe because the spotlight is not that high on the Cardinals, so this helps them out a bit there. But they just seem to be we're just going to move forward. We're gonna make some good trade backs. We're going to earn some value, and we're going to try to play in a reasonable way and not just go crazy also on spending and things like that in free agency, where maybe you could have if you said, we're just going to pile everything in around Kyler this year now that he, with the injury coming back, and see how we are. I think they're doing a pretty good job, being that they had Kyler. If you have Kyler, you're going to stick with Kyler and stick with the contract and everything else. I think they've done a good job navigating a tough situation where, again, the stakes were not high. So that helped them navigate.
Yep, I think all that's fair. I'm very interested to see how Kyler looks in year 2 back from injury, and how if he. I think the talent is definitely there, but the results have not necessarily been, and especially in this past year. And you could say, oh, he's coming back from injury, so that makes sense. But if it's still not, then it'll be very interesting to see
it's not good that we're talking about. I guess it's 4 years ago now. But there was a period of time halfway through the 2020 season, I think, where it was Kyler Murray is, could be MVP of the league right now. And I don't think that was totally fluky. So at least he has, as opposed to someone like Daniel Jones or someone like that, at least he has, potential to get to that sort of outcome, I think. Okay, who do you have as your fourth?
I put the Browns. You probably have them higher, but
no, I actually removed them. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I can't take it anymore. There's like, I don't know what that's going on over there. But anyway, go ahead.
I think like they've made a lot of low cost additions at wide receiver over the years, and just like trying to add guys. The Amari Cooper one has worked out, I think. It's hard to get over the Deshaun Watson trade, but it's also hard to know like whether that was ownership telling them to do something. And then like all those surveys by Seth Walder always points out the Browns as being like really informed by analytics and stuff like that. It's kind of the Browns, Ravens, and Eagles as the top three in this.
Uh-oh. I heard the warning sign.
Sorry everybody, but I do need to go, but I want to hear sell me on the Colts, and then I'll give you the rest of my top five, and then I'll listen to what you say later.
Okay, I guess one other thing on the Browns is just like lack of hope. I'm kind of like, I don't know. I mean, maybe Watson will turn it back around, but we'll see there. So okay, so the rest, so the Colts I actually moved down to being second best, where I had him at best before. So I still have Philly at third. Colts at second. I'm going to put the Ravens at first, and you know, I don't know. The positional value thing is troubling, but track record, not doing bad things otherwise, continuing to kind of work that formula, I think has been good for them. I think they did a really, really good job with the Lamar Jackson situation last year and everything working out. So I'll give them credit there. And I guess for Philly would be the one where I'm not sure if you have them higher or not, but I just think how he's playing with fire with the contracts and other things there. So maybe I'll expand upon that after you leave.
I had the Eagles one, which I think I did last year too, and when it was possibly easier because they were coming off being in the Super Bowl and almost winning the Super Bowl. But I don't think they've done enough in the past year to move them off that spot. And I think a lot of how one views the Eagles is how one views Jalen Hurts and whether the extension was a good idea and how much they're going to regret that in the future. Okay, sorry to ditch early, but I enjoy this as always.
I'll give my anti-Eagles take when you're gone and can't defend yourself.
Okay, I'll listen to it later. Okay, thanks, Kevin. Bye.
All right, man. All right, so let's do the Eagles thing here, and I think this is interesting because the Eagles is they're the favored franchise for the media and cognoscenti throughout the NFL. So here's the thing, and this is interesting because I was listening to a podcast just because I'm all about sentiment, trying to figure out what's going on sentiment-wise in different areas. So I was listening to the Athletic football podcast, Robert May's podcast, and Nate Tice is no longer there. R.I.P. Nate Tice there. I was also listening back to last year's podcast when Nate Tice had Justin Fields as the 11th quarterback that he would choose. So that was, but he also had Jordan Love. So I guess he's like a high risk, high reward sort of guy. But anyway, so they're drafting quarterbacks over the next 3 years. Contracts are part of the situation, but I think what they found out versus prior years is that contract probably doesn't matter that much at quarterback because as long as you're good, you can restructure and figure everything out. But anyway, so when they were ranking the quarterbacks, and I think they're too low on Hurts, but this is at least something to think about. They had Hurts as 14th of the 15 quarterbacks that they drafted in this exercise. Now, I mean, they also, they had Drake May and Caleb Williams in there. So they did have a couple of guys who were like literally rookies that we know nothing about above them. It's also interesting Last year in their quarterback draft, they had Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson, but not CJ Stroud in there. I mean, he probably would have been next. So it's interesting that they leave out Daniels this time around. So maybe Daniels would be the best quarterback then if he's the one that people are leaving out, despite the fact he was the number 2 pick. But for the fact that Hurts is so low and he was 8th for them a year ago, and, I don't think that Hurts is 14th. I'm not even sure he's 8th because of the value that he brings rushing, and he did have some injury problems last year. But I do think you at least have to ask yourself, is he a Justin Herbert? Is he a Trevor Lawrence type of guy when we're talking about the outcomes? Is he a Joe Burrow? Is he a Josh Allen? Is he a Patrick Mahomes? Is he even a Kyler Murray when it comes to those sorts of outcomes that are possible? I mean, I don't think so, really. And the contract that they gave him, if you look at this contract, I mean, they are tied in forever. So it's kind of the flip side of how I liked what they did with Carson Wentz, how they got off of Carson Wentz, the optionality that they had bringing in Jalen Hurts. They just don't have any of those options. And they're really layering these contracts with a lot of dead money in the future. And so far, Howie's been able to Houdini his way out of a lot of different stuff that's going on there. But are you going to be able to Houdini your way out of some of these things? Can you pay AJ Brown and Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert and one of the top offensive lines in the NFL and Jalen Hurts? We're kind of going on, this is like almost the third year in a row of all-innedness for this roster, and maybe you can keep pushing it forever, but we're going to have a little bit of a reset period. And is Jalen Hurts the guy who can take you through a reset period in the same way a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen or a Lamar Jackson or a Justin Herbert could do? Waiting to be seen. But I guess, I don't know. I just think there's a lot of risk in that approach, and that's why I can't put them there near the top as I would have before. It's just risky. And again, like all the good things they did with Wentz and bringing in Hurts and all that sort of stuff, you just don't have that. You just don't have that with Hurts. The deal has all these option bonuses that trigger in the future to extend caps out further and further and further into the future. I mean, they're like legitimately tied into this contract for 5, 6, 7, 10 years until Jalen Hurts retires. Unless you're taking a massive cap hit and you're just starting all over. And I'm not sure the Eagles are in a position to do that, or going to be in a position to do that for a while. So that's why I'm a little bit less, but I still have him as third best because I am giving Howie credit for pulling his Houdini moves that he has been able to do in the past. And then for me, I'll just go through the rest of the rankings here. So for me, I still have the Colts as second best. And I know they're not a lot to get excited about. I agree there. But I just feel like Ballard, and maybe I'm giving too much credit for the fact that he is a cheap owner who's not going to like throw the bag at too many people. You're not going to do anything too aggressive. You're going to be okay on positional value. You're going to take your shot at quarterback when you finally had your shot. You're going to trade back and get about 11 million in trade value and trade backs. They've done that consistently. I don't know. I just kind of like it. And I know that it's really going to all hinge on whether or not Richardson hits. But if he does hit, there's a lot of good potentially could come from how they've built this up and not pouring too much in the past, where they could have had multiple all-in type of years, whether it was when they first brought in Carson Wentz, whether when they had in, Phillip Rivers, who was pretty decent there, going all the way back there, how they negotiated things. I think Ballard has operated like someone who has a lot of job security. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know, but better decisions come in that sort of manner. So I am flipping it between them and the Ravens, just because the Ravens deserve a lot of credit. And the one thing the Ravens have the problem with, though, is the positional value. Losing positional value this year and the year before. But if you continue to stack value in other places, then you're doing well. One other thing to on the radar about the Ravens that some teams that we should be thinking about, and is the fact that they had 0 comp picks this last draft. 10, 12 years, they had 0 comp picks. So that's something that they've been living off of. Talking about comp picks, another thing with the 49ers, they've just been totally living off of comp picks that they've gotten for their coaches and front office people being signed to other places. Those are massive comp picks that you're getting for the diversity initiative. Like, you're getting 2 third-round picks. So that's happened, I think, 4 or 5 times now for the 49ers that they've gotten all those picks out of it. There's a comment here about they can cut Hurts in 2027 and save $20 million on the cap. The problem is this contract is like really difficult to even figure out. So let's go to this. Maybe I'll even bring it up on the screen for people here who want to check it out, because I do think this is, like, the details on this very, very, very confusing, because those numbers do not reflect some of the real details. I know it's not OTC's fault. It's just like things end up triggering in the future, and then that's when it becomes a problem. So if you look at the Hurts deal, And this is what ends up being confusing on it. And I'll try to bring it up as big as possible for people to see. Oh, there we go. It's even bigger here. So if you look at what happens here, look at this. So it has a guaranteed advance. That's not it. Guaranteed advance. So salary guaranteed. But you have these option bonuses, right? So you have all these different option bonuses. And when that bonus gets triggered, it's gonna then be prorated out over time. All these different option bonuses that are being prorated. And it's going to continue to kick further and further. Now, 2027, 20 million, I think there's a problem there because the 2027 guaranteed salary becomes guaranteed in 2026. So again, that's another 22 million you have to add to that number. And then, so it's really more like 2028 that you can cut, and there'll be some savings because the savings will be completely wiped out by the fact you could trade them. So that would be you could maybe trade them after 2026, but you can't really cut them because, again, the 2027 salary is now guaranteed in the 2026 preseason. So that's money. So you're going to have to trade them to someone. But again, you got all these option bonuses. I don't know. This thing is like so confusing. I had a better grip on it before. I've kind of forgotten how it works. But trust me, there are issues for this thing going out. And if we're saying 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe you can cut them in 5 years is the best case scenario, but you can't even do it in 5 years. Maybe you can cut them in 6 years is the best case scenario. Maybe you can trade them in 5 years. That's a lot. That's a lot that you're gripping onto for a quarterback. So anyway, so that's the Howie thing. That's the Howie thing with everything that's going on there. Great job by them, but we'll see how it ends up going. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I may come back later this week to discuss if there's anything interesting going on in the NFL. Otherwise, I'll try to bring some more guests in the offseason. Subscribe over to unexpectedpoints.com. Please help support everything that I'm doing over there. And until then, I'll be talking to everyone next week. Thanks.